It was the night of February 10th, 1306. Two men met in a church near Dumfries in southwestern Scotland. Their names were Robert the Bruce and John Comyn. Both were representatives of some of Scotland's leading noble families, with past aspirations to the throne. They had a tumultuous history, to say the least. Their respective families had been long-standing, bitter rivals, though in the aftermath of Wallace's defeat, they had briefly put aside their differences to become co-guardians of Scotland, before the Bruce faction reverted to their loyalty to the English King Edward. Now, at least nominally, they both served a foreign monarch, while plotting ways to expand their own power. The details of the encounter are not known for sure, but what is clear is that the meeting became heated, and then turned violent. In the confusion that followed, Bruce stabbed Comyn, leaving him bleeding out and dying before the altar. Robert the Bruce then fled the scene, and the die was cast. Through this act of violence, not only had Bruce committed murder on sacred ground, but he had effectively entered into open revolt against his nominal feudal lord, Edward I of England. Now outlawed by Edward and excommunicated by the Pope, Bruce, realizing the desperate situation he was in, decided to go for all or nothing, and attempted to seize power for himself. Supported by Bishop Wishart, Bruce was crowned by Countess Isabella of Buchan as King of Scotland, with much regalia and celebration. Around the same time, he and his supporters quickly captured a number of strongholds to strengthen their position and prepare for the inevitable response. Bruce had some significant allies among the nobility and clergy, but the country was still very much divided between those favoring Robert the Bruce and loyalists to Edward. Many nobles, especially the Comyn clan for obvious reasons, were staunchly opposed to their new would-be king. His position was in truth quite tenuous, as even Bruce's young wife, Elizabeth, daughter of the Earl of Ulster, jested that they were but King and Queen of May, reflecting the uncertainty of their status. Furious that yet another rebellion had taken place in Scotland, Edward was quick to respond and dispatched his lieutenant, Aymer de Valence, at the head of a force to put this revolt down. Robert gathered his army and marched to meet the enemy near Perth. Upon arriving, he supposedly demanded that de Valence come out and fight him, which he refused, and Bruce fell back to his camp. Little did Robert know, but the English commander fully intended to fight, just on his own terms. Later that night, de Valence's army sallied out during the cover of darkness, and caught Robert's host unprepared while it was encamped, with many men gathering firewood and foraging. Completely surprised and unable to put up a coherent defense, Bruce's army was quickly defeated and scattered, the king himself just barely escaping and being forced to flee for his life. After the defeat at Methven, Bruce's remaining followers retreated, harassed by enemies and defeated by the rival MacDougall clan. During the course of this ongoing disaster, his army effectively disintegrated and ceased to exist as a fighting force. The king eventually fled to the islands to the north, where he was at last able to find some shelter among allies in the region, the MacDonalds. Meanwhile, Bruce attempted to send the female members of his family away to safety, but they were intercepted and captured. His sister Mary, as well as his ally, the Countess of Buchan, who had crowned him just shortly before, were locked in cages. His older sister Christine, wife Elizabeth, and young daughter were imprisoned as well, while his brother Neil was captured and executed. Despite these massive setbacks, Bruce gathered what resources were available to him, and with ships generously provided by the MacDonald family, decided to go on the offensive, launching amphibious landings in mainland Scotland with the hope of regaining the country. This was to be a two-pronged attack, with one force led by Robert in person and the other by his brothers, Thomas and Alexander. It went to disaster almost immediately. The force dispatched to Galloway was defeated quickly by the local MacDowell family. Thomas and Alexander were wounded in the fighting and captured. Like Neil before, they were swiftly executed. The message was clear: there would be no tolerance for rebellion. Bruce himself only did a little better. He landed at Ayrshire and defeated a small English force in a skirmish, but was unable to capture the nearby fortress, and fled into the hills with his small army. Bruce's fortunes had reached their nadir. According to myth, he saw a spider continually trying to build a web. It failed again and again before finally succeeding. Reminding him of his own plight, its persistence encouraged him to continue. Although this is likely nothing more than a fanciful fable, it became an important part of Scottish national identity later on, showing how Robert continued to strive even when all hope seemed lost. Putting down the rebellion likely seemed little more than a formality at this point, as Bruce's ragtag army just needed to be crushed. An English force under Aymer de Valence, the man who had previously defeated him at Methven, caught up with the Scottish king at a place called Loudon Hill, intent on ending Bruce's so far short and unlucky reign once and for all. Here, the English heavy cavalry, confident of victory, charged the small Scottish force, fully expecting to ride them down. However, the Scottish had erected field fortifications to bolster their defensive position. The charging knights were restricted by the trenches and funneled forward into the mass of waiting Scottish spearmen, where they were defeated, and then forced to withdraw. Bruce had won his first victory. Loudon Hill would almost certainly have been just a minor setback for the English, if not for what happened next. On July 7th, 1307, Edward I of England died. Though he may have been a cruel man, there was no doubt he was a great leader, and his passing was a heavy blow. Edward II, his son, took the throne, but he lacked his father's forceful personality and ambition, and would not prove a very well-liked or successful leader. He attempted to continue his father's mostly successful military ventures, and launched another campaign into Scotland in 1310, but the Scots simply avoided battle, and Edward returned home, humiliated and empty-handed. The situation would not get much better for the hapless monarch, who now had to face internal domestic strife as well. Resentful of the influence which the knight Piers Gaveston had in the king, and seeing Gaveston's position as blatant nepotism, many leading nobles rose up and actually had Gaveston executed. Needless to say, Edward was furious, and the situation nearly became an all-out civil war. Taking advantage of this internal English turmoil, which gave him some breathing space, Robert set about consolidating his control over Scotland, and making sure his position could truly live up to the title of king. In a series of campaigns, he captured many fortresses and dealt with domestic enemies, including the Comyns, MacDowells, and MacDougals. He defeated most of these enemies, and took much of their lands. Though it didn't bring his dead brothers back, it may have gained some degree of fulfillment, knowing their deaths had at least been avenged. Still, there were still a few castles in Scotland which the English possessed, and as long as they remained in enemy hands, his control over the country would not be secure. One of the most important of these English strongholds in Scotland was Stirling, as it stood at a strategic location, essentially cutting the country in two. Bruce thus made it his next target, and a force under the king's brother, Edward, put the castle under siege. Then, in what we might see as a rather quixotic and characteristically medieval gesture, The garrison agreed to surrender by June 24, 1314, if its garrison was not relieved by that time. Meanwhile, Edward II, who was seeking to regain some semblance of control over his realm, realized he was on the verge of losing his father's hard-won conquests in Scotland completely, and prepared for another northern campaign. Having stabilized the political situation sufficiently, he began assembling an army, hoping he could regain Scotland and win a victory which would solidify his position at home. Once he had mustered a large enough force, he marched north to relieve Stirling and hopefully replicate his father's successes more than a decade before. The opposing armies were likely not all that different in terms of basic building blocks, so to speak, but they differed significantly in composition. The English army was probably somewhat larger, with a corps composed of heavily armored and armed mounted knights. They were supported by a number of longbowmen, who had been used so effectively by Edward at Falkirk, and an assortment of relatively ragtag infantry, many of them levied from the northern counties. Although Edward's host almost certainly outnumbered the Scots, it is unclear how many of the infantry levies remained by the time of the battle. The Scottish army probably numbered several thousand strong. It likely contained few heavy cavalry and only a small number of light horse. The main component of the force were infantry, armed with long spears, fighting in dense defensive circles called schulterons, though there were also a small number of archers. This composition had proven effective in the past, as the bristling wall of spears could sweep all in front of them, but as Falkirk had shown, it was also quite vulnerable to archers, as the large blocks of spearmen were sitting targets for the English and Welsh longbowmen. Edward's host ponderously made its way through Scotland and neared Stirling. Bruce's army stood in their way, but his next moves were unclear. To abandon the siege would be a major setback, allowing the English to relieve Stirling and opening up Scotland for further conquest. But to give battle against the superior English force could mean a complete disaster and the reversal of everything he had worked so hard for. The Scottish army nevertheless made their stand to the south of Stirling, ready to retreat if things went badly. Bruce's host was organized into 3 divisions, one commanded by himself, another by his brother Edward, and one by the Earl of Moray. When the larger English army finally reached Bruce's position, it was quite strung out and disorganized from the long march. The mounted vanguard, commanded by the Earl of Gloucester, pressed ahead against their Scottish foes. At this point, an English knight named Henry de Bohun supposedly saw a lightly armored Bruce riding out in front of the Scottish army, surveying his troops' deployment. Seeing his chance to end the war with a single blow, he charged. Bruce was surprised, but resolutely held his ground. Armed only with an axe, he stepped to the side and brought the weapon down against Bohun, killing his enemy with a single blow to the head. Emboldened by their leader's courage, the Scots rallied and pressed ahead. Against an impenetrable forest of pikes, the isolated cavalry vanguard melted away and fell back. Though little more than a skirmish, the Scots had definitively gotten the better of the day's opening move. Supposedly, when later chastised for risking his life in single combat, Bruce responded that he only regretted the loss of a good axe. Though we should perhaps take this whole story with a grain of salt, as another account goes that Robert killed Bohun with a blow to the back as he was trying to retreat, and it seems plausible that the story of glorious victory in single combat against a better armed foe is a piece of pro-Bruce propaganda. Around the same time, some English cavalry, probably numbering a few hundred, commanded by Robert Clifford, attempted to skirt around the Scottish to break through to Stirling and link up with this beleaguered garrison. They rode through open terrain and made good progress, getting to within sight of the castle. At that point, though, Moray's division of spearmen emerged from the forest and confronted Clifford. The knights charged, but in a furious clash were unable to pierce Scottish ranks. Defying traditional military logic, the infantry proved impervious to mounted knights, and the humiliated English cavalry had to retreat. The first day of fighting had seen poorly organized English attacks fail miserably, but these were in reality still just skirmishes, and the main bodies of either army had yet to clash. Despite these initial setbacks, Edward started moving the bulk of his army against the Scots, though much of the infantry still remained further south, and planned to launch the main attack on the next day. It was now the moment for decision. Robert had been successful so far, but these minor clashes did not guarantee success in the upcoming battle. He still considered slipping away during the cover of darkness. At that point, a Scottish knight serving in Edward's army arrived in camp. He informed the king that the English host was demoralized and poorly commanded. With this, Bruce made his decision. When morning came, the Scottish army was seen debouching from their wooded position, coming down from the hill, and forming up in battle order. Despite still being outnumbered and the horrendous consequences a defeat would entail, Bruce, likely encouraged by the previous day's successes and the seeming lack of strong leadership in the English army, decided to risk everything and launch an all-out attack. Edward and his army were taken by surprise, and they scrambled to meet their attackers. There was a brief archery duel, which the English archers got the better of, before the two lines clashed. English heavy cavalry, led by the Earl of Gloucester, hurriedly counterattacked, and made a determined effort to break through, charging against Edward Bruce's leading formation. But they were held back by the virtual forest of Scottish spears, and many noble knights died, including the Earl himself. As the battle raged, English units rushed forward to engage their opponents, but being cramped together and the unexpected nature of the Scottish attack prevented their response from being more organized. There were many archers in the English army who could have dealt the Scots a withering barrage as they had done before at Falkirk, but now the best they could do was shoot over their own soldiers' heads, hoping the arrows might find a mark. One detachment, however, managed to cross the Pell Stream and form up on the Scottish flank. They began subjecting it to enfilading fire. This could have potentially turned the tide of the battle, as the dense block of spearmen was powerless to respond. Realizing the potential danger, Bruce hurriedly ordered his reserve of cavalry to charge, and they managed to scatter the longbowmen before any major damage could be done. Though many individual soldiers undoubtedly fought bravely, confused, disordered, and not properly deployed to begin with, the English army began to crack under the advance of Scottish spearmen. Soon, what little discipline that remained evaporated, as the Scottish short-rods resolutely pushed into them, and the English formations collapsed, the men fleeing for their lives. Even though many of the foot soldiers had probably not yet even taken part in the battle, with the defeat of their cavalry and advance units, they too were swept up in the rout. Edward II and some of his retainers cut their way through and managed to get to Stirling Castle, but were unable to enter and had to make a circuitous retreat before finally getting to safety. It was just as well. If he had actually managed to take refuge in the doomed fortress, he almost certainly would have been captured, and the already crushing defeat could have been even more calamitous. Within the confines of a single morning, the English army was shattered as a fighting force. This invasion of Scotland had been a disastrous failure. Edward's beaten army was harried out of the country, and Stirling Castle surrendered shortly after. Many English nobles had been killed or captured in the flight, and the latter allowed Robert's female family members, who had been taken captive years earlier, to finally be ransomed back in a prisoner exchange. Bannockburn was not the end of the war, as conflict would drag on for years. But after it, Bruce was always on the initiative, raiding in northern England and making it clear to Edward, who now had the upper hand. Robert's brother, Edward, invaded Ireland with the goal of opening a second front against the English. After some initial successes, he was killed in 1318. In the scope of things, however, this was just a sideshow. Eventually, Edward II managed to muster another army to invade Scotland again, laying siege to Berwick. Cleverly outmaneuvering the English, a Scottish force under Sir James Douglas raided into England. An army was hastily formed in response, but was utterly defeated at the Battle of Myton. With his rear and lines of communications threatened, Edward then had no choice but to withdraw again. Eventually, Edward II was overthrown and killed by his wife, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, in 1327. His son and successor, Edward III, made peace with the Scottish. Though there would be continued battles between England and Scotland in the centuries ahead, Scottish independence was effectively secured, at least for the time being. Like Courtrai, somewhat earlier, Bannockburn showed that heavy cavalry, unsupported by archers and their own infantry, could be defeated by a resolute force of foot soldiers. Indeed, one of the main reasons for Edward's defeat was his complete failure to properly use longbowmen as his father had. The trend of infantry taking a more prominent role continued through the 14th and 15th centuries, and eventually saw the rise of professional bodies of foot soldiers. Paradoxically, perhaps, through Bannockburn, the English received the gift of defeat, as they seem to have learned this lesson. In the ensuing century, they would use similar tactics, both against the Scots at places such as Duplin Moor and Halidon Hill, and against the French during the 100 Years' War. By having nobles dismount and fight alongside archers and infantry, the English had arguably improved upon what the Scottish had started. In Scotland, the importance of the battle has perhaps surpassed its historical significance, as it understandably became a major part of Scottish identity. For example, historian Angus Constam described how Scots can recall Bannockburn with the feeling of pride over having gotten one over on the English, which at least in a light-hearted and jovial form even continues to this day. As a result, Bannockburn is perhaps rightfully seen as the greatest Scottish victory of the medieval period, counterbalancing defeats such as Halidon Hill and Flodden Field, and will most likely continue to be remembered in such a way for the foreseeable future. This has been the end of my first series, though there will certainly be many more. If you like this content, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.